3 o'clock now. I hope, like me, everybody else was walking a little bit in the last half hour. Try to get maybe some food and stretch. Or maybe you're sitting on a sofa right now and you're not in the school building and you're totally relaxed and you're just zoned in. That's whatever you got to do. Let's just take care of our wellness. So this is going to be the third and final in our series today on getting started. And now we're going to talk about systems. So again, myself and Heather are going to be presenting. And we have a really exciting team of chat panelists, some new faces that are joining us for this session. And we're going to formally introduce them in a little bit here. Some of the housekeeping stuff, let's just remember our expectations, be responsible, kind, and safe. Focus on how you communicate and chat, especially. It's been a great group today. You guys have been answering each other's questions and helping everybody else out. So we've really appreciated the chat engagement. If this is your very first session, you know the tabs are on the right. That's how you'll navigate chat and polls, and we'll tell you when to go to polls or when to see files. You should see everything else on the left. We're going to use chat for question and answer. That's really been working best since we have chat panelists. So just go ahead and use chat. If you accidentally navigate away from the system, just find your card and log back in. And if you need any tech help, go ahead and hit that help desk button. Okay, so norms for chat. It would be helpful to us when you communicate in chat, if you could say your district, your state, and your position. That makes a difference, helps us think about your perspective. Some very similar questions can have different perspectives depending on where you are within your organizational structure. So help us out in chat and continue to share that information. Okay, here we go. Third time today, but we're going to be even more concise so we can spend more time on the systems pieces. PBIS is a framework. That's the first and foremost thing. It's not a program. It's not a book that you're gonna buy and give to everybody and say we're gonna do this curriculum. It's a framework. It's what holds all the pieces together and helps them operate, much like this example of a bicycle without a framework and one with a framework. When we apply that framework over the years, we've learned of a couple different ways of thinking, how do you go about this work? And this one from our return to school resources is a great example on the right-hand side here. So when we're thinking about getting our students engaged, we think about connecting with students first, then screening our community and our students to say, what do we all need? What do some students need specific help with? Providing that support, defining what that is, teaching the explicit social skills, emotional skills, behavioral skills for our students and staff to be successful, and then monitoring with data. So that's an example of an organizational structure. You take the framework and then you implement it through a process like that. Talked about this a couple times already today, but you guys already heard my passion. I love this document. It is worth reading every word. That's not even a joke. It's really worth it. I'm already highlighting and we're making slides about it. But the Office of Special Education Programs published this really important brief on supporting children's social, emotional, behavioral, and mental health. And the Midwest Network, the Center on PBIS was instrumental in the research over decades that helped inform what's in here, and then also the most important current messages that we're sharing, and you'll see those embedded throughout. When I look at these 7 recommendations, that was sort of a highlight from one section. We're just going to focus on number 4. What's the framework? You have schools, have your school improvement process. You want your school and your community to achieve some goal or to be better in a specific way. You want a framework to organize the educational, social, emotional, and behavioral health supports that you have. And that's really what today's conversation has been about. Let's make sure this is something that sticks. So don't start PBIS unless this is something that you think is going to be important to you for the next 10 years. Otherwise, you're going to possibly suffer from this common occurrence of initial enthusiasm, initial implementation, and then moving on to something else. My short and sweet definition, what is PBIS? This is the best way I can put it. So it organizes your school to achieve its outcomes, what you prioritize as your outcomes, through understanding your data, providing a continuum of practices, supporting staff through systems, and prioritizing equity across all of those features. We talked about this before, but what we mean by outcomes are obviously the social, emotional, academic competence of our students. What we mean by data is the data we're going to use to inform the decision-making across these components. By systems, we mean how we're going to support staff, and practices are that tiered continuum. What are we doing for all students? How do we repeat and make more specific additional doses for students who need more, for some tier 2 supports? And how about when we need to individualize those practices for any specific need a student would have? That would be a tier 3 support. PBIS is the social, emotional, behavioral MTSS framework. About 80% of the research that has gone into MTSS came out of the work that we've done in PBIS. And if you take this example of how to define MTSS, these 6 components, you can see how they layer on to systems, practices, and data. All right. This is a great overview slide, sort of the why, the what is it, some of the summary, some of the key messages. You want to keep these principles, this logic in mind, especially as you take the information you've learned today and you're deciding, how am I going to bring this back to decision makers on my team, at my organization, so we can make decisions about moving forward. It's a very useful slide to refer back to. All right. If you implement this with Fidelity, you take your school and you compare it to a similar school that's not doing this work with Fidelity. So maybe a school of similar demographics or setting, for example, and you look at those two schools. Schools that implement with PBIS with Fidelity have these evidence-based outcomes that you can see across the research from the past couple decades. So improved student outcomes like academic performance, outcomes for students with disabilities, reduced bullying-related behaviors, reduced exclusionary discipline, and then improved outcomes for teachers as well. So perception of teacher efficacy, organizational health and climate, the perception of the community about the school itself. All right, so one way to organize PBIS is through those components: outcomes, data, systems, practices. We measure, are we implementing tier 1 of PBIS using, there's several different tools, but a common frequent tool is the tiered fidelity inventory. And that tool is great at breaking down the components. But when we try to tell the story of how do you go about starting this work, here's an example of a logic that we've used, and that seems to help people help teams with figuring out where they're at and where they need to go. So the quick view again is start with the team. Is it representative? Does it have leadership authority? Does it have the voice of the students and the voice of the community and of the staff doing the work? So do you have a well-represented group in a shared leadership model? And from there, they should be saying, representing all those voices, what's the vision for our school and how are we going to define that through specific expectations? Then once we have that vision and expectations, how are we going to task analyze those across settings? So we know, so teachers and students know how to demonstrate the expectation. How do you demonstrate being kind in 10th grade history class, for example? Then we have to have a system for teaching it. You can define expectations and you can task analyze them, but you haven't done anything unless you explicitly teach the skills for students to demonstrate those expectations. So that's a system for teaching, or your curriculum might be another way of looking at it. And then you have to now give feedback. So let's give performance feedback. Let's use praise, specific praise, for when students are using the skills that we just taught. When students need more support or they're having some behavioral errors, what's a response strategy we expect all teachers to use so we're consistent in how we see behaviors and then how we respond? And then finally, what's the data that informs this whole process? So across the fidelity measure, it's these 15 components, and this is how we would map them to that sort of rollout logic. We've already gone through today, starting with data, and then we did those practices pieces, vision all the way through to preventing. Now we're kind of coming back full circle, and let's talk about this system. Now that you understand sort of the data and the practices involved, how are we going to build this, and who's going to be involved, and how are we going to support our adults in that work? So that's what we mean by those systems pieces. We're going to switch over now. I'm going to put up the polls again. So if you haven't already, go to the tab that has the polls. There are 4 questions for you. Those do map to the fidelity inventory a little bit, just a different wording. But answer these for your school, and then we'll share some results at the end of this session as well. And while you're doing the polls, I'm going to stop sharing. Heather can go ahead and pull up her slides, and we're going to introduce our chat panelists. And that was 6 minutes.
That was good, Brian.
No, that was 11 minutes. I can't do math.
It was still good for 11 minutes. So hi, everybody. Great to see you again. And thank you for coming back. And if you are brand spanking new and jumping in now and have not seen C1 or C2, where we covered the data and the practices piece, you know, now we're talking about the systems piece. And if this is the first time logging into this, which hopefully it's not, but in case it is, just know that I highly recommend you reviewing and seeing what we had covered in those other 2 pieces, because the whole point of this was we developed it as an entire product, so that the big takeaway was you kind of got a really good sense across all areas. And again, we're multitasking. We've got the pre-assessment going on, or the polls, and then you're going to have access to these fantastic exemplars. And so I want to introduce you to the exemplars that we have. And these are going to be the folks that you will pick their brain during the next almost a little over an hour, asking them specific questions. You'll even have their contact information. So if you did not get enough of an answer, you know how to contact them. But they were specifically hand selected because we knew that they had some fantastic stuff to share, particularly around the systems piece. So I think this is a great opportunity for you to learn directly from them as well. And then Brian and I will be covering the content kind of simultaneously. So who is our very first exemplar? Betsy, if you could, yes.
Hi, everybody. My name is Betsy Lopez. I'm very, very thrilled to be here with you today. I've been involved with PBIS for almost 20 years, which is a little shocking, but I first started at the school level as a school psychologist, supporting elementary, middle, high school, then worked at the district level as an MTSS facilitator, supporting K through 12, both public and charter schools. And for the past several years, I've been a technical assistance provider with the Florida PBIS project. So I've been able to see PBIS through a variety of lenses, and I'm really excited to be able to share with you today. So please feel free to ask any questions in the chat that you may have. I'll try my best to answer them.
Awesome. Thanks, Betsy, for being here. And Jay.
Everybody, work with community schools, which is really talking about how do we take resources from out in the community and bring them into the school and connect school resources to the community. The idea being that schools are a place and a set of partnerships is a good way that is described by some national community schools folks. Our community schools work relies completely on the PBIS framework, and been working with PBIS about 10 years and really operate across multiple districts, a little bit of coaching, a little bit of supporting, a little bit of problem solving. And I think I'm very excited to be here today just because I think that the teams are so important. When I train locally, a lot of times I train this part as sys teams instead of systems to try and put that emphasis there. And I really appreciate everybody dedicating time to think about how to work together best for students.
Awesome. Thanks for being here, Jay. And I hope you have drank a lot of coffee today. Awesome. All right, Angela Hernandez from Arlington Independent School District in the Dallas-Fort Worth area was planning to be with us today, but unfortunately had an emergency, so could not be with us. So somebody who you may be familiar with, who was with us in C1 on the data piece, is Teresa Sotomirski, and Teresa has also worked with Angela. So she has been willing to step in as not only our tech support, but also to serve as an exemplar as well. So Teresa, would you like to say something to the group?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming to our session this afternoon. My name's Teresa Sotomirski. I work with Florida's PBIS project, and I've been with them full-time since 2006. So I'm looking forward to our session and interacting with you in the chat pod.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks, exemplars, for being here. Okay, awesome. Fantastic time to, like I said, pick their brain. So now let's talk about the systems piece. So we talked about data earlier today and the types of data to help us in determining where are problem areas, how are we doing with this, what could we be doing, and then when we start to implement some of the practices, thinking of that data to help us guide, is it making a difference? Are we implementing it with fidelity? How is it impacting our outcomes? Now we're going to talk about those systems that we need to set up in place to keep the train running, essentially, to get everybody on board. Essentially, like I said in the last session, yes, we want the kids to exhibit positive behaviors. We want them to be successful, productive citizens who are responsible and respectful out there in the world. And we also need the adults to be able to model it at the same time. So it's not just an issue of this is what we're doing for the kids, it's also what we are doing for all of us as well, because we also want to be enjoying our jobs and establish this positive climate in which we're all working under and spending a big amount of our lives in. So if it can be a positive environment, wouldn't that be great? So one way that guides this, or the biggest way, is a leadership team. So depending on where you guys are coming from, if you're at the state level, there's a leadership team. If there's a district level, ideally you'd want a leadership team there. And if you're at a school campus, you would be thinking of that school leadership team. And there's two different functions that we're talking about for leadership teaming. When we're looking at executive functions, that's who are your stakeholders or the folks that you're going to be impacting most often. And you think about it, well, as an administrator, it's going to be your teachers, your staff, your students, your family members. Then you've also got the school board, the district level folks as well, and community members. What types of funding do we have available to help support this? And how does this align with other initiatives or activities that we've already committed to in the past, or that we may have currently going on? When we're talking about implementing PBIS, how does this impact our policies that we've got set up? I think one thing is always the student code of conduct. If it's completely filled with all of these reactionary measures, when we start to implement PBIS, we've got to think about, wait a minute, we need to share what our expectations are. We need to share what we're doing here for, how we're responding if problem behavior does occur, and how we do expect folks to be on campus and what we're doing around that. So that can impact some policies. But then workforce capacity, that means, about building the professional development, but building the skills of our folks that we're working with and that are working with our students. From there, it gets into that implementation piece of the training or that professional development that you're attending, the coaching or technical supports that you're receiving, or technical assistance. And then evaluation is that data piece. It's that ongoing continuous improvement piece to help determine, are you on track? Are you making a difference? From there, the goal is that you would start to develop this demonstration, and you may become a demonstration so that others can come and see, whether it's other stakeholders that you've got in your district or the school down the street, or maybe it could be the White House. Sometimes they want to come and visit schools that are implementing PBIS, and they'd want to say, what is it? I want to experience this positive climate. And so again, we're looking at using our data, setting up and using evidence-based practices, and we're going to have this all guided within a system that is guided by a team. So looking at, oh, look at this fancy animation. Brian had put that in there that I did not know existed, but that was great. So for the third session of the day, that was the excitement. Nice job with that. So, but think about PBIS is that framework for aligning your initiatives. Like I said in the last session, my goal is you guys were to walk out and know that PBIS is not a program. It is not a curriculum. It's important to know it is a framework, and you may sprinkle it with all kinds of evidence-based interventions, programs, whatever, but you're going to have your data guide you in what is needed before you start selecting those evidence-based practices. And then we've got to figure out how that fits within our system, how we're using our data, and then guiding and communicating to folks, what are we offering for all? What are we going to do, and what our data decision rules are for some? And then what will we do for those that need the most intensive supports? So it's important to think it's a great way to help organize all of the amazing things that you do on your school campus probably already, but it helps structure it up in a much more organized way and helps guide and direct what we're offering for our students that are coming to our campus, the range of things that are being offered. And it's going to vary from school to school or district to district based upon your needs. So one of the resources that that we had created for you that might help with some of your discussions out there is why it's important to prioritize behavior support. And because sometimes folks are thinking, there's a big push on the social emotional aspect, which I view that as a great thing. Finally, folks are saying, oh my gosh, this is important. I think the pandemic, finally got people stopped, and they're like, wow, we do need to focus on this, and we need to focus on the adults too that are supporting kids. But we've got to make sure that we also prioritize behavior in there as well, because behavior is the stuff that tends to get kids kicked out. Behavior is the stuff that tends to get kids into more restrictive settings on what that behavior look like. And so we still need to prioritize behavior support and set up as much preventative practices and establish that preventative system and be less reliant on that reactive system. So you can click directly on that on the picture of prioritized behavior support, and it will take you right there. Another practice brief that we had developed is building a culture of staff wellness through MTSS. So when we're thinking of that multi-tiered system of support and providing supports for students, well, I think around two with the pandemic, as folks did realize the adults need to be taken care of as well. And so you've got to think about, again, it doesn't mean you have to do another thing. It means, how do we get this to fit within the PBIS framework? Because again, we are setting up this community of supporting each other. So if you haven't had a chance to look at those, please take a look at that, and it'll help give you a gauge of understanding how these all fit together and work together. So something that I'd like for you guys to consider is, we have talked about in the last session, when we're looking at our data and determining where are problem areas, that might help us guide and determine what types of expectations we may need to develop. What is it that we want to change? What is it that we want to be instructing more on and providing support around? But there's got to be a reason from it, and it's got to be driven by that vision. And the only way, to help get other people on board to help support this is we've got to have a reason for doing what we're doing. And so for you guys to think about, why you would want to engage in a social emotional behavioral system, why engage in the PBIS framework. So I want you guys to think about, what is it that is really driving it, and why you wanted to be here. Some of you may have been told you got to be here because you're brand new to it. Don't worry, everybody's been there in different spots for different things. But seeing this slide, what is your why? And so this might be an opportunity, and we're going to be looking at the chat box, but I'm just curious to know, especially if you've been here the last two sessions back to back today, what's your takeaway and why? Tell us what your why is for your school or district, and go ahead and put those in the chat. While you're doing that, I'm going to go ahead and keep talking here. But one of the things to also think about is this is something that you can also take back to the rest of your faculty. It's something you can also take back to your district folks, and to have them sift through and think through it, and to go like, what is it? Why do we want to do this? Because essentially that common vision to develop a common language and common expectations needs to be driven from folks that are in leadership, and that team needs to come together to have that dialogue, because it's going to help you stay focused. It's going to help you stay purposeful in this process. So I think that's, you can't always underestimate how important this is, but it's also important that even later, if you've been implementing for a year or two, to revisit what the vision is, because this is also a way that you're communicating to everybody too, in helping to share why you're doing what you're doing. All right, so looking at the chat, we've got, teaching, building a caring culture, setting up for the whole child, teaching behaviors, expectations, improving my job with more fidelity. That was great. So yeah, keep adding that in there. That's awesome. I love that you guys, you want to build positive systems because you guys said that you have a lot of angry children. So that is being proactive too. So awesome. So some things to think about for some guiding questions. So you guys probably already have some type of team on your campus. You probably, my guess is you probably have a lot of teams for a lot of different things, maybe a lot of different committees. So therefore, do you need a new team? So that's something to think about. It's like, do we need a new team, or is it something of repurposing an existing team? Or maybe it's about dismantling a few teams that may not be as effective, or maybe they have common missions, or they have a lot of the same people anyways that are on those teams, and think about how can we repurpose them around that, or could it be integrated within another existing team? So I think it's important that if you're jotting down some ideas of how to take this back to your school, your district, is to take some time to think about what are the structures of your various teams that you have, and who or which team might be most likely if you're going to be repurposing, dismantling, that type of thing. Again, my big thing is don't reinvent the wheel. Don't add another team until you figured out, is there a way that you can remove a team? Because chances are our schools are not that big where they're things are mutually exclusive. Oftentimes it's a lot of the same people sitting on the same team. So how can we start to be more efficient with our time? So things to think about in your teaming structures. This is just an example. It's not the one way or the only way, but it is just one example that Midwest has on a tier 1 team, for example, that typically when you're looking at their structure and who is involved with that they might have, they're looking at their data systems, the teaching system, setting up the acknowledgement, and they're communicating across the board to all their folks. And they have various members that are involved with that. But this is also an example. There's a tier 2 team, a function-based problem-solving team, and then a tier 3 systems team. Again, this is not saying that there are multiple teams. Just because there's 3 tiers does not mean that there have to be 3 teams. What's important to know is folks need to know what their job is. So if there's a team, what's the role, what's the data that you're using, and it's really clear what their function is. But it's quite possible that a school that's pretty proficient with their data and they're really clear in what they're doing, they could serve all tiers. It's quite possible. They just need to know when they're addressing what and what data they're using during that team process. So it's, again, this is just something to think about, but just remember 3 tiers doesn't mean you have to have 3 teams. I think it's also important to know there actually is research around what effective leadership looks like. And some of the research is showing it's evidenced by teams and individuals who have a clear vision for change. So, we talked about what is your vision in the last session. In the data piece, we talked about where are the problem areas that you've been seeing, because that will help you generate what some of those guiding or school-wide expectations would be. You've got to have a clear vision. What is it that we'd like to see for our school campus or for our district? We're also seeing they're focusing on the school and their students. They're creating relationships with their various stakeholders. They're engaging in problem solving. They're identifying and correcting barriers and goals, which in order to do that, it means you've got to have data that you're looking at and you're problem solving during that process. They're applying appropriate strategies based on school needs. They're evaluating the effectiveness of their strategies using their data, and they're investing in that professional development piece. So again, all of these different areas that we've been talking about all day today, you can start to see where they would come up. The goal is that you guys would have effective leadership so that there is this effective organization that is driving everything for your school culture that you're establishing. So how are we going to do this? It's about defining, not just the team, but there also has to be effective meetings that occur as well. And sometimes, for some of our schools, I think it's always important there's core team members, like those members are always there. The administrator, if there's somebody that's a coach, who's going to be your recorder, who might be your data analyst per se. It's possible those roles shift as long as people are aware who those folks would be when they're shifting and they're okay having those roles shift. One person can serve multiple roles provided that they know those are their roles. And so I think that piece is like clearly, the more that folks know and can expect from people on that team, the more we can see that team is going to be effective in their implementation. So building that leadership team, remember we talked about the effect, what the research shows around effective teams. That's in the left column. So the Florida project here has, some team activities and various roles that folks are doing across the board. And I don't know if that one might not be hyperlinked, but needless to say, it's something to think about of if you're going to be on a team and you're in charge of tier 1 for PBIS, people need to be aware of what their job is. And so they need to be clear in that responsibility. But know that everybody coming to the table to be on a team is still going to be in different places. And so I think it's important to know that it might take some team members some time before they kind of figure out, oh, now I get this. This is what I'm supposed to be doing. Hey, now this makes sense. And then they start to have a much stronger voice and communicating out there. But I think it's totally fair for folks to know that just because you've been selected or voluntold, or you volunteered, or you've been elected, who knows, that people are going through kind of different things, trying to figure out, how does this impact me? Why do we need to do this? And so they're trying to figure that out in this process, and just know that that's a normal human process. It's important to pay attention to with that, but it's much more helpful when it's guided by a clear vision that folks who are on that team have helped co-develop. So developing that vision, developing a purpose. Here's some different examples of that. This one with Southwest I thought was great. It just happened. Obviously, this came up before pre-pandemic, but I was sitting, I think at the Houston airport, and they had just finished training with all of the folks at the gate who worked for Southwest. And this was the thing they came up with, and they were trying to remind each other, like, let's wordsmith what our vision is. Again, that's big difference than saying, here's what the vision is, now commit that to memory. This is where, okay, this might be what our vision is, but what does it mean for me in the day-to-day interactions? And it starts taking it in a much more, a little bit deeper, more purposeful level. But vision statements and purpose and why we're doing what we're doing can also be done in the classroom too. So it may not be just a district saying, here's what we're talking about for leadership and we're going to exemplify behavior, but it could be also, what does this mean for my classroom and let's work with the students and let's talk about what does it mean to be respectful or to be a cardinal as we've defined it in the district. And they talk through it. That's starting to get some of that ownership, that buy-in piece of some of your stakeholders. So characteristics of effective teaming, what's needed to make all of this work? We've got to have that foundation. Again, the clear purpose, some well-defined goals on that. I think it helps to have some established norms, like you're going to start the meeting on time, end the meeting on time. You know, have come up with some system if somebody's going down a long path that has nothing to do with what you guys were talking about. How do you rein that in? What's going to be the procedure that your team comes up with? But I think it's also important to have diverse skills of team members that are on there. It's important too, I think that there's a positive environment, that there's some balanced participation, there's open and collaborative communication, and that there's these trusting cooperative relationships. We're also seeing an effective teaming for that process is that they are using data, they are engaging in decision-making, and that there is participative leadership that's occurring. All of these interact with each other, but it's going to require ongoing professional development and technical assistance to keep folks working together and to help prevent that implementation drift like Brian had talked about earlier. All right, so goals and objectives. So you think about like, right, what would my goals be? You got to, again, start with the vision. And so some of these pictures are taken straight from a district. So from that vision, what are some 5-year goals that you would like to see within your district or within your school? But then let's actually map out with the 3-year goals. Let's break that down. If we're going to, you know, achieve this within 5 years, what's it going to take for us to get there? And within 3 years, which means let's walk backwards now in 1 year, what do we need to accomplish? And that will keep us on track. So it's important to think about when you develop these goals, whether it's for your school, whether it's for your district or state, could even be professionally as a teacher. You're developing goals within your classroom for the school year. You know, do they align with the vision? And if they don't, you might want to go back and readjust, because obviously you want to be having this meaningful and purposeful. And hopefully all of this is captured within an action plan. You know, there's the one on the left, the tiered fidelity inventory. That's the action plan that's available. You should be able to click on it. If not, the link is right towards the bottom. But that action plan is specific to the items within the TFI that we've discussed today. But if you wanted just a generic action plan, there's the other one that's available, I know, on the Florida website. You can create your own action plan. But what's important is that what is identified is somehow captured on the action plan. Persons are identified as responsible. There's a method in how you're going to measure it, and there are deadlines and some type of accountability measure that's set up with there, because I know we all get busy. And so we've got to figure out and have other team members know if somebody's falling behind, what is one of the norms you're going to do to help support that person. So some of those, let's go to the district now and talk about district responsibilities. So if you are based at a school right now, you might be thinking like, well, this isn't my responsibility because I'm at the school. And technically you're right about that. Your responsibility is your job at the school. But what I want you to know is that if you're wanting to set up PBIS framework and establish a system for pro-social support on your school campus, at some point you're going to need to get district support in that process, whether it's additional professional development, whether it's additional support that comes in, whether it's assistance around the data that are being used, or if you need to adjust a policy for your school that may be a district policy. Maybe it's additional training that needs to occur, and how you're able to get your district folks to see that what you're doing and the differences that you're making could be helpful for other schools. At some point, it's going to be important to communicate this information. And you may be serving at some point, if you're at that school level, a local demonstration. So this is a Florida one. If you're wondering like, what's a YIP? Florida refers to it this way, a yearly implementation plan. You can call it a district action plan. You can call it a district leadership team meeting, whatever. But essentially the goal of a leadership team at the district is to come up and develop their action plan. How does this fit within their vision? How are we going to coordinate our activities to support PBIS across our district? And they're going to be helping to identify what those outcomes and goals are going to be, how they're measuring it, who the resources that they're using across their district, and start to organize and plan the supports for those schools. This is the part, again, that I love about PBIS that I shared with you guys earlier. Nobody's exempt. The same process is for the school. School team still has responsibilities too. It needs to be based under their vision. Hopefully it's aligned with the district's vision. But they've got specific responsibility to develop that core curriculum for the social emotional behavior supports. Their responsibilities to oversee Tier 1 implementation, ongoing evaluation and progress monitoring by using their data. And they've got to communicate and train their staff, students, families, and keep their community partners involved with this process. So nobody's exempt. They all have various responsibilities that are similar to each other. The role of the administrator, this is a really, really crucial part of this whole process. And so factors we've seen that increase the likelihood of principal support, it must be perceived to solve the problem. Again, is it meaningful to me? Where am I in this process? How is it going to impact me? Is it worth my effort, essentially, in doing this? Must be compatible with one's beliefs, values, and prior experience. Key opinion leaders must support the innovation. It's initially implemented on a small scale before scaling up across grade levels, and outcomes of the innovation are visible. So let's go back to number 4, where it says initially implemented on a small scale. So that's something, if you're at the school level, it could be, we might be focusing maybe on just one grade level, or we might be focusing on just setting up clear expectations in the cafeteria before we bring on the entire school. You might also see, you know what, we're putting all this effort in this one area. Why don't we just do it school-wide? But again, you have that decision to make. Another thing to look at for a district is, rather than mandating or saying everybody in this district is going through, you know, Tier 1 PBIS training, why don't you try with some schools that are wanting to do this? Start at a smaller scale, show your successes, build your local demonstrations, and then get other people on board for this, and start to carefully plan out the various district resources and personnel that can help support as you're expanding across the board. Again, this whole piece of building the system, whether it's at the school level or the district level, it needs to be carefully planned out. It is not just a PD event, and it most definitely needs to be using data and to think about how are we going to support as we're going and increasing. Various administrator responsibilities. They're actively participating on teams. I think it's important for teams to define what active participation means on a team. Again, don't assume that people know what you're talking about. And I only say that from direct experience. I have had administrators in the past that have said, yep, I'm there. And occasionally they'll pop their head in and they'll want to be defined as I'm actively participating because I know a team exists. I know they meet. I'm just not necessarily there to meet with them. To me, that's not my definition of an active participant, but that's something that's important for folks to be able to define, that we know that schools that do much better, that administrator is attending and actively participating on those teams. They're communicating the commitment to everybody else. They are the primary spokespersons of that. They're familiar with the current data and the reporting system. This is written as part of the priority within the school of one of their top 3 school improvement goals, and they are allocating their resources to support either team meetings or any PBIS activities that are occurring, and they're ensuring that those meetings do take priority on that school campus. So Brian, you want to share with them this example of a school in Illinois, I think it is?
Yeah, sure. So we're doing a high school project, and so this is from years ago, but a high school shared with us how they decided to organize their tier 1 team for climate and culture. And part of the focus when you have big schools, so I say high school, but if you have a really big school, for example, you kind of do want more adults involved. The more adults that are involved are more connected then to the decision making. But you also don't want 20 people sitting at the core group for decision making, because that's a very difficult team to manage. That was my personal experience. I had 20 on my first team in a small school. That was a mistake. So what this high school did is they asked the question, they said, okay, for our tier 1 team, what are we going to say are the core responsibilities of that team? And they came up with, the team's going to be responsible for monitoring the data for tier 1, for working on the teaching and the curriculum, for a communication plan to inform staff and students and community, and then for building the acknowledgement system. How do we acknowledge and give feedback to students for all of that? So they asked that question first, then they defined them. And so what I think happened from memory was the data team had kind of 2 people who led that, who were then on the core tier 1 team. Teaching had 2, communications had 2, acknowledgements had 2. But then the data team might have had another 4 teachers that helped them with that work. They just weren't coming to the full tier 1 team. So I thought that was kind of a smart way to think about organizing this work in bigger schools, or maybe specifically like in a high school. Good example to share.
Thanks, Brian. I've been looking at the chats. So if you hadn't heard of a snack master before too on a team, I completely credit my years of living in Louisiana for that. So I learned you do not have a meeting if there is not food involved whatsoever. So and we did tend to have much more effective meetings. I do have to say that. And depending on the food, sometimes we needed a nap afterwards, but we weren't collecting data on that. So all right, so let's talk about the database procedures. So that's another piece of the system aspect, is figuring out, okay, again, we talked about data in the first session. However, the procedures aspect of the data and how you're collecting the data, how you're accessing the data, how you're using that data and making change on campus is part of the system. And so that's sometimes where it gets a little tricky. Like, it's just not as simple to just say, we're just going to talk about data and that's it, because it's all so interrelated. And the data that we're looking at is related to the practices that we're using or maybe not using. And so you can see how they're all connected with this. So some of these, different ones, there's a tier decision guide around virtual instruction. There's, specific around virtual, there were clear procedures that were established for this one district here, talking about like, okay, if a student is not engaged in the virtual instruction, here are all the various things that to go through as a teacher to assist with that progress monitoring and the next steps. But also, how are you communicating the data across your school campus, or even for your faculty, or even for your community members? I think it's always helpful for even students to have an idea and a gauge of how things are going. I mean, if you're asking them to do certain things on campus that are new, performance feedback makes a big difference and helps people understand, oh, this is why we're doing it. I think also too, another piece for the systems is to figure out what your routines are for ongoing implementation across the school year. And so from here, if you're wondering, like, I'd love to see this, you can go straight to the Florida site and in our live binder, and you can see examples of this in blank. I think there's blank versions in there that you can fill in for that. But I think it's good to have a plan for when you're going to be rolling this out on your campus. So remember, you guys have identified the problem. You've identified clear expectations. You've come up with, it's good to look at a schedule and start to say, like, all right, here's when we're going to start to implement. Here's when we're going to train our faculty and have the discussions with them. Well, if you guys decide that you're going to include your faculty in the development of the expectations and the rules, just know that it might slow some things down a little bit, because there's going to be many people that are going to have a voice to it, and it might take some time to wordsmith some of the work. But in the end, everybody's had a say. Hopefully it will be implemented well. It's also good to have, though, a schedule of when you're going to be reteaching, when you're going to be planning to reteach, to help folks stay on track. Remember, it's just not a one-stop shop. It's an ongoing process to maintain, and it's something that you want to be able to sustain after receiving training in this. So supporting staff, we've got to think about, this was one of the districts, they had their professional learning community norms. I think it's important to not only have norms established, but it's also important to give your adults some feedback, get feedback from them, have them do anonymous surveys too. You know, sometimes data are not pretty, but I have to tell you, we've got to look at real data in order for us to figure out where we need to make changes. And so then it's important for them to know if you are looking at the data and reporting that back. You guys use stuff like this already, like the parking lot back in the days when we're face to face with trainings and you're walking up and, you know, putting a sticky note up there. There's all kinds of different things. If you're virtual, you can use Jamboard and have people post all kinds of different things for feedback. But it's important that you're getting people's feedback, their voice in this. And again, sometimes we can't adjust and do everything, but it's important that their voice is heard and that they're understanding that this is another source of feedback. Like we talked about this morning in the opening, you heard the voices from the students. That is more data, that is feedback. And if we were getting, you know, feedback from students saying like, I feel safe at my school. I feel like there is an adult I could go to if I was having issues. That's a huge thing to celebrate. You've definitely done something right there. We've also got to look at how we're supporting our family and our communities with this. So, you know, just because we're setting up expectations by setting matrix for our schools, we can provide guidance for how our families can do this at home. So if you were respectful, responsible, and safe at your school, those were your guidelines. You can give families help, like, hey, something you might want to think about. What would that look like at home? You know, would that mean that the students making their bed? Would it mean that they put their dishes in the dishwasher? You know, is it that they're moving their bicycle off to the side so the car doesn't, you know, drive over it? But give that feedback, because again, these are not just skills that work in the school setting. They're going to work in the home setting. They're going to work in the community life overall setting. But then, you know, what kinds of ways can you get folks involved in this process? How do you keep them connected? How do you let them know, and, you know, what are different things they can do to help support what you are doing at the school, but also to let your community members know. I mean, we've had one school where the store owner came into the school and just said, hey, I want to let you know that there's a couple kids that kick down all of the trash cans on the way to school. And thankfully, most of them are empty beforehand, but sometimes they're not. And so is there anything that you can do about this? Because this is a problem for us, because we're trying to man the cash register and then go out and clean up the trash outside the store. And so the school and the community owners worked together about how they're going to provide feedback. And the school had said, hey, when you do see a student maybe pick up some trash or whatever, can you go out and give them this one token that we're using here at school? And it's a different color coded system, but it'll be worth double at school here. And we're going to talk to our students about taking care of our community, and talk to our students about what we expect and what we'd like them to do. And the community member came in and said, I can't believe it, how helpful this was. Does it solve every single thing? No, but it was a way to start to get folks aware, like, we're all in this together. We're all helping each other in this process, and we can work together. So how do you do this? This is some stuff for you guys to think about, for questions to consider. Thinking about who is going to be on your team. If you're coming from the district level, that district leadership team, who would be on there? Who'd be the likely people to pick? A school-based team, who would be the folks that you'd want to recruit? And then revisiting roles and responsibilities. It might be that you need to define the roles. I would highly recommend you go to the TFI and look at some of the items that they have under tier 1 related to that, but then helping to define what's people's function on that team. Do any changes need to be made? So if you're using an existing team or you've already had an established team, it's important to revisit that to make sure that it still is working and meeting the needs of your school. And how does your team plan to involve your staff, students, and families? And I think that's hugely important because, again, depending on where you're coming from, you've always got to think about what does everybody need, what does some need, and what a few need. And for this session, that was the focus around building your system to be able to support that. So I am going to turn it over to Brian to talk about, he had a look in his eyes like, I'm doing what? But I know you guys are filling out the polls and love to hear what you guys have said. And it's another example of performance feedback. See? What you have to say matters. Yes.
Okay, and let me see if I can show up. So this, be able to zoom in a little bit, kind of helps with seeing it. Let me see. So here are the items that I think are helpful to organize when I think about systems. So do you have a shared leadership model? We're trying to grow the blue, if you recall. So about 25% of you said that, yep, we have a team in place with shared leadership that's responsible for climate, culture, social, emotional, and behavioral outcomes. This next question is, how effective is that team? Are the procedures in place so they're effective and efficient in the work they do? And again, we're about 25%. Professional development. Do our staff feel supported and confident in their use of the practices related to climate, culture, discipline? Now we dropped down a little bit. Now we're at about 12%. The TFI asked this question a little bit more about, do you have PD in place? I think for this sort of different way of wording it, I like to think of it as, so what's the outcome? The competence and confidence of our staff. That's really the goal of professional development. So it might be a good way to consider that. Then engagement for communities, families, engagement for students, for example. Our leadership team regularly informs and gets the input of all faculty, family, and students on our school climate efforts. And we're at about 16% for that. And this came up in the chat. I saw this before. Well, now I can't remember if this was the last session or not, but we talked about student voice as a part of an important component. This came up during the practices section. People were talking about adults get hung up on high schools a little bit and saying, well, how does this work in high schools? It's quite remarkable how high school students respond in very predictable ways to direct instruction, to feedback, and to reinforcement, just like all human beings do. That's how it shapes our behavior as well. And to help you, you really need students included in the decision-making processes. So when we talk about these leadership teams, not only should students be a part of those teams, especially at the high school, because they're going to answer questions about social validity for you on your teams. They're going to help you say, oh, that's a good idea, or that's not going to work. Let's talk about how we can do this. But also, then you need a process like this question is getting at, which is, and then how do we get feedback from all the students? What are the surveys we use for student satisfaction and perception, for example? And how do we report out to the students? Here's our goal for the month. We're trying to help students with, achieve these two objectives. That's our goal. And this is what we're gonna do to help you get there. So that sort of two-way communication. So that'd be a way for engagement. I'm focusing on students, but then faculty would be the same way. Getting the input of all faculty through surveys, reporting out to all faculty, or through PLCs, or through regular other structures you already have in place. So we appreciate the data. Hopefully that's kind of a good look, and it'll be interesting to see if this kind of holds true with sort of the folks coming to the table here, getting started with this work. It looks like we have, so this is perfect. Our goal is to give the last 15 minutes here to additional question and answer. And all right, so I'm gonna jump in with one. And while I do that, if Teresa and Betsy and Jay, if you see any questions that you thought were pertinent to maybe get your voices in the room on or respond to, please consider those. But Leanna asked, how do we solve overrating? So that's a common thing that can happen because we try to be efficient with this work, which means self-assessing. A lot of the work is self-assessing. And whether it's teachers saying, oh, I have a great positive to corrective ratio in my classroom, which a lot of adults like to say they do. Direct observation of that particular skill is very informative. And so you would just treat it with you would just recognize the best of intentions that adults would self-assess, and that's a good place to start. And it might be a skill that then when you do observational data across your teachers, it's not matching the self-assessment, and then you can action plan accordingly. The key for me for all of that with tier 1 is think of your teachers as a group, as part of the community. Tier 1 support for your adults is, okay, what percentage of our teachers feel confident with their use of specific praise? And then when we observe, if we observe 5 out of our 50 teachers this week, and we see, oh, about only half of them showed the skills, that would work. So 5 divided by 2. 6 of our teachers we observed, and half of them showed the skills we wanted. We're going to go back to the staff and say, hey, we did a quick check, and it looks like about half of all of the staff. So my point is, we're not here, when we're talking about the tier 1 supports and building the system, this is not the time to say, okay, Betsy's classroom practices are subpar, or Teresa is saying she's great at effective praise, but she doesn't understand that at all. You're looking at the whole. How do we get 80% of our adults in our building feeling confident and competent? And that's a great thing for teachers too. They want to feel that kind of support as well, knowing that they might need tiers to get there. Betsy, Teresa, any thoughts, anything that you read?
Yes, actually, Brian, if it's okay, I would like to turn the conversation to a different topic, if that's all right.
Yeah.
Okay. We had a couple of participants talking about large scale implementation. So if you're starting kind of from scratch and you're expected to suddenly implement PBIS at many more than one schools, are there any resources to support that large scale scaling up of PBIS?
Yeah, and I saw some of the responses. I think we have a really good chat panel here, because my first thinking is start smaller. But I think one of the chat panelists said smaller could be okay if you have to have 35 schools starting with this work. You might want to have something that's pretty reachable for all of those schools as they explore it in their first year. If you have the luxury of saying, let's do a demonstration and do a lag process where let's bring on 5 schools and learn, and then let's bring on another 5, that's a good approach too. I think the key takeaway I would have is the district itself, in this case, really needs to say, is their system in place? How are they going to support 35 schools? It's easy to say all 35 schools have to do this, but that doesn't mean the structures are in place. So there's a tool for the district fidelity of this work, which we call the District Systems Fidelity Inventory. And essentially that's asking the district, do you have your structures in place so schools are best positioned to do their work with fidelity? The unit of measure is at the school level, but the level of support really comes from the district. So if you're in a place where the decision is we're doing this with all of our schools, it's okay, it's going to go slow, but you must focus on the district system itself. Otherwise, it's going to be a really long road for those 35 schools. So those would be my thoughts. What else? Any other questions that have come up that we should bring to the whole group?
There was a lot of interest at the beginning of the session talking about staff wellness, and do we have or can we recommend a screener to screen for staff wellness? I know that there are some resources in the guide that you and Heather shared. I was wondering if you guys had any other recommendations.
Yeah, Heather, does anything come to mind for you?
Well, you're dealing with adults there at that point. So I think that's a group I'd probably head straight to like your student support services folks to see what they are recommending within the district for the adults, but I don't know offhand. Yeah, and I can't remember offhand, even if were specific on offering resources for that in the guide on setting up that culture of wellness for the adults.
Mhm. You know, one of the things that we talk about with our team is we think about how often do you hear things as quick solutions to staff wellness? Well, eat better and exercise, take physical breaks. Like, I mean, I haven't moved out of this chair barely for 15 minutes all day. And you can tell me to eat better, but it's been 50 years of my life. I'm not going to start that now. So we have all these ideas. And I think one of the things that when we were working on some staff wellness logic and sort of rolling that out, it's really about the active practicing of skills and reporting out of skills and those things that seem overly simple. The truth is a lot of adults don't do them. So if we have self-regulation routines for adults, which I worked in a residential school for many years. And so we had self-regulation routines. We would have the adults practice the routine in a non-stressful time with other adults, and then we would be able to use those routines more likely when we were dealing with a really difficult child behavior, for example. So that's one of the ways that we think about it. I think the wellness brief that was shared in the notes is exceptional, and that's a great place to start to frame all of this work, and it'll give you more ideas. And then if you go back to yesterday's sessions, I think Amy from our team might have done a session on wellness. I know she was getting a lot of praise. She always speaks about wellness, so it might have come up in context there. But look at the other sessions and catch the recordings, and you can dig deeper into those systems too.
Yeah, Brian, you know, that's a good point. There's a whole strand on the mental health aspect. And so you may want to look at those recordings there that they had info. I'm reviewing the brief right now. It gives strategies for folks to use, but doesn't necessarily refer to screeners for the adults per se. Another resource I was thinking of is the clearinghouse that has been set up by Secretary Cardona about what folks have done during the pandemic. And they're constantly taking in exemplars from across the country of various things. And I know one of the things they had was a school had set up a safe zone for teachers. And in fact, I think this was down in Key West. I know, go figure, Key West. But it wasn't what you thought of for your times in Key West before you got on the cruise ship. So, but it was really cool what they had set up for teachers to go in and be able to take a break during that time, but it wasn't addressing the screening process per se. Are there other questions? We have just about 7 minutes left.
I'm going to drop the evaluation link as well. You can see that through the files tab or other places too, but I put that in chat. And we would appreciate hearing your feedback about today, especially in this specific session. We can also open this up to any questions that might have come up earlier today as you reflect upon data, as you reflect upon practices, which was, we had to kind of truncate the end of that session. But any questions that we have there, feel free to put those in chat as well. We'll give a minute while folks are typing. Can grade level teams versus the PBIS team develop their own teaching matrix to match a school-wide? You know, that's a great question. That comes up quite a bit, which is we have school-wide expectations. Do all teachers have to have them the same rules for those expectations in their classrooms? I don't know of one research validated reason to go one way or another on it. I think it's a great question for your school. So, you know, should the entire science department have the same expectations in our high school? Because we have some common, settings, for example. Maybe that's a rationale, or maybe all ninth grade should have the same one because that's our welcoming grade for high school. We want every teacher. Maybe in an elementary school, we want every single teacher to have the exact same one, or specifically fifth grade, because our substitutes are always grade specific. So that's a question you go back to the team on. The key is going to be the expectations are the same. So what we don't want is school-wide, we're responsible and we're kind and we're ready to learn. But then in our grade level, we're going to change those, and we're going to change them to, be here on time and be respectful and something else. The expectations have to be the same. How you turn those into your specific classroom, I would have the team guide that conversation and decide what makes the most for your school, makes the most sense. And then you sometimes have to revisit that. Don't print them on the world's most expensive chart paper that you hang everywhere all the time. Know that the rules that are inside your matrix, the context changes. I mean, we learned that a lot over these last couple of years. You have to update those every once in a while. The expectations should be similar, but sometimes we need different examples on the inside.
I see there's another question related to how do you handle an unsupportive administrator on the leadership team? So Jay, Betsy, have you guys ever come across that? I know I have at times. I don't know if either one of you want to weigh in on that, but again, I think what's important is to always couch it as, sometimes people need to understand how it's going to impact them. There is systems change literature that does show, this, I need to figure it out. Like, how is this going to impact me and why do I need to do this? And so sometimes that's where folks are in that process. And so data tend to speak for itself. And it might be slower going though for you if you do have an administrator that is not supportive, which means you have to do a lot more kind of grassroots stuff individually in your classroom or across some classrooms without that full leadership support, and continue implementing where you can with fidelity and continuing to show data. But Jay, Betsy, Teresa, you guys have anything else to add to that?
Heather, I agree with you. Something else that I've heard, and this comes out of the transformational, I forget the official term, it doesn't matter, but basically the phrase is, don't take down a fence until you know why it was put in place to begin with. So if you have an administrator who's resistant to PBIS, I would sit down with that individual and find out what are their concerns. Is it a time thing? Is it a transparency thing where they don't want to share data with stakeholders, which is part of that whole planning process? Find out exactly what their concerns are and start seeing if you can have a conversation, see if maybe you can get permission to try strategies in isolation here and there. Help administrators, sometimes it's just a matter of clearing up and helping them see that much of what they're already doing is consistent with PBIS, and you're maybe just looking at tweaking something instead of really introducing something radical. I mean, it varies, right? It depends what the administrator's objections are, but definitely sit down with them and find out where is that resistance coming from. And then I think, Heather, the strategies you were sharing are also right on target. That's the next place I would go.
I entered a few comments in chat, and I would concur. I think then it becomes very much about that circle of control concept and doing the good you can do. And then, depending on the grade level too, PBIS in even a single classroom or even a single grade level, what's a grade level leader? What's a department chair? What are other supportive leaders that can be brought into play just to generate and activate support? I think the toughest thing is operating feeling unappreciated or unsupported. And my encouragement when I was on faculty at a high school level was to seek encouragement and appreciation from our fellow department members in the ELA department. And I think that sometimes even more than the specific nuts and bolts of the work, having that sense of support is important, and the team can construct that for itself.
Awesome. Thanks, Jay. Well, so if you're looking, I don't know, Brian, are you still sharing your screen, or if I should be
I'm
sharing
not.
your screen?
I'm not, but I did put the evaluation in the chat.
Okay, perfect. So just as a reminder for folks, the evaluation is available in the chat box, as well as it's the second to last slide in your handouts. So if you could please complete that, that would be fantastic. Also, as a reminder, the very last slide, hold on that. Here, these are hyperlinked, and so you can go directly to them. So a lot of the resources that we did talk about from the National Center on PBIS, Florida PBIS Project, and Midwest, you can click right on there and it can take you to those. And all three of them have search boxes. So you can type in what you think you're looking for, and you can see, my gosh, there is probably thousands of things related to that topic. One of the other things that did come up about questions around virtual school is that there are a lot of resources, and one of the resources I did share from the National Center is the Responding to School from Crisis. And if you go to the pbis.org site and click on or Responding to Crisis, Returning to School from Crisis, something like that. Sorry, it's been a really long day. Click on there, but that's going to talk about giving you lots of options to not only getting back to in person, but also that hybrid piece. And you can pull lots of information around virtual on there as well. Or you can type in the search box and say virtual or hybrid, and it'll pull all the information for you. So if we don't have additional questions, remember, if more questions come up later, you've got our contact information. You've got the exemplars contact information on their slides. Please fill out the evaluation. If there are ways that you see how this could be done differently, like I said, this is typically tier 1 PBIS training, can be anywhere from 2 full days to up to 10 full days. And so you got this section in 75 minutes barely. So just know if you feel like it's a lot and your head is spinning, it is a lot, and your head probably should be spinning. So, but hopefully not too badly, and you can go hang out on the couch before the facilitated discussions tonight. So thanks everybody, and enjoy the rest of your evening, and we hope to see you tomorrow in the Strands. Thanks.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.